Jamaica's finance minister is set to take up a new role as one of the IMF's managing deputy director, and the move is being hailed as a win for Jamaica. But is it though? No doubt he is more than qualified for this position. That's not even the question. The question is, why does the IMF need someone from a developing country to be on its executive? To answer this question, we need to know what is the IMF and what exactly it does. Now, the IMF's own website says that it works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all of its 190 member countries. The IMF has three critical missions: furthering international monetary cooperation, encouraging the expansion of trade and economic growth, and discouraging policies that would harm prosperity. But how does the IMF achieve these critical missions? Through something called structural adjustment. According to Investopedia.com, structural adjustment is a set of economic reforms that a country must adhere to in order to secure a loan from the International Monetary Fund and or the World Bank, including reducing government spending, opening free trade, and so on. In simple terms, structural adjustment is supposed to help a government manage its economy effectively. Most often it does so by reducing government spending, mainly by slashing the public sector and slashing social and welfare programs. Proponents of structural adjustment argue that by bearing some short-term pain in the people's pockets, the economy will be better off for it in the long run. However, much like trickle-down economics, there are several examples of structural adjustment worsening the poverty rates in developing countries. Let's look at the case of Ghana. In the 1980s and 90s, Ghana abandoned its socialist reforms and embarked on a series of structural adjustment programs supported by the World Bank and the IMF. The country is often hailed as a success story for structural adjustment policies, given that in the short term there was real economic growth and productivity increased. The results were achieved through labor retrenchment, trade liberalization and devaluation, subsidy withdrawal, and an increase in user fees, which rendered basic services like health and education unaffordable to the average worker. The result included high unemployment, as thousands of people lost their jobs, particularly in the public sector. Any economic gains were quickly outweighed by the removal of subsidies from agricultural products and the introduction of user fees in hospitals. The rural poor, and especially women, were the most affected by a cost recovery system introduced in public health care, with many turning to traditional healers and unlicensed drug sellers. In short, while macroeconomic indicators show positive effects of structural adjustment on development and growth, many Ghanaians find it difficult to cope with the overall effects of adjustment. Problems posed to many Ghanaians included the high cost of utilities, the withdrawal of subsidies on health, education, and agricultural inputs, the retrenchment of labor, and the consequent high unemployment rate and chronic low salaries for workers, especially in the public sector. In his paper entitled Ghana, Structural Adjustment and Democratization, Boafo Arthur wrote that the implementation of structural adjustment was without citizen participation or input, adding that there was genuine fear that democratization and its embedded freedoms would lead to a revolt by the masses against further imposition of draconian adjustment policies. The paper concluded that democratic principles, which stress competition for political power, open political process, and respect for minority interests, are deemed to contradict adjustment policies, which in the African context are seen to be best pursued by an undemocratic and ruthless regime. And this brings me back to the appointment of Jamaica's Finance Minister, Dr. Nigel Clarke, to the IMF executive. No doubt he is more than qualified for this position. That's not even the question. If we look at the history of the IMF, we can see why it's important for them to have someone who is intimately familiar with how these financial systems work in the developing countries. Who better to sell these policies to developing countries than someone from a developing country? The people who think Dr. Clarke's appointment is a win for Jamaica are sorely misguided. He will be working for the IMF. What exactly do they think Dr. Clarke is going to be saying in those IMF meetings? Oh, don't do that to Jamaica. Those are my peoples. Those are my boys. These people are sorely misguided because he's going to be employed by the IMF, pushing the IMF's policies that have decimated the economies of developing countries for decades. At some point, we have to recognize when people have chosen themselves and their own well-being, their own economic prosperity over country, and stop hitching on this representation thing. Because the minute that someone steps over onto the side of the capitalists and the imperialists, they're no longer on your side. That is who they represent. And that is something that we have to come to terms with.